Dance for me, Adrian Khalil said, his voice calm but heavy enough to silence the entire room. The low hum of jazz fading into nothing as I turned toward the woman standing under the amber lights. Maya Brooks didn't move at first, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn leather bag, the edges cracked from years of use. Her reflection caught briefly in the mirrored wall behind the bar. A simple black dress that didn't quite belong in a place like this, shoes polished but aging, shoulders squared like she had practiced holding herself together long before tonight. The kind of woman people overlooked until they needed something from her, and right now, what they wanted was a performance. But for Maya, this wasn't just a moment. It was a calculation, rent due in 48 hours, a pharmacy receipt folded 3 times in her pocket, and a little boy at home who had asked her that morning if everything was going to be okay. She had smiled and said yes, even though she didn't know how. And now here she was, standing in front of a man who could solve every problem in her life with the flick of his wrist. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, the kind of man who was used to people saying yes before he even finished asking. The stack of cash on the table between them wasn't messy or desperate. It was precise, intentional, almost clinical, like he was conducting an experiment, and maybe he was. Because to him, people were patterns, predictable, especially in places like this, where money translated into obedience, where desperation could be measured in seconds. He had seen it all before, the hesitation, the compromise, the quiet surrender, but Maya didn't move. Not yet. Her eyes flicked once to the money, then away, as if acknowledging it meant accepting something she wasn't ready to take. The room waited. The bartender paused mid-polish. A couple near the window leaned closer. Anticipation thick in the air. Adrian's gaze sharpened, curious now, because hesitation was interesting. Hesitation meant resistance, and resistance meant there was something beneath the surface. It's just a dance, he added, softer this time. Not kinder, just more deliberate, like he was adjusting variables. Maya inhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and then the music shifted, not louder, not faster, just present. A quiet piano threading through the silence. And finally, she moved. Not the way the room expected, not the way the money demanded, but slowly, deliberately, each step controlled, as if she was telling a story no one else could hear. There was no performance in it, no attempt to impress, only something raw, something restrained, like grief wrapped in grace. Her arms didn't reach out, they folded in. Her steps didn't chase attention, they grounded her, anchored her. And for a moment, the room didn't know what to do with that. The laughter that had been building died before it could form, replaced by something quieter, confusion, maybe even discomfort, because this wasn't entertainment. This was something else, something too real for a place built on surface-level exchanges. Adrian felt it before he understood it. A subtle shift, the way the energy in the room tilted, the way his own expectation no longer aligned with what was unfolding in front of him. His fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in judgment, but in focus, because this woman wasn't responding to the money, she was ignoring it, redefining the terms of the moment entirely. And that wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not with him. Maya turned once, her gaze sweeping past the crowd without landing on anyone, like she wasn't dancing for them at all, like they were incidental, background noise in something much more personal. And for a brief second, her hand brushed against her bag, just enough to reveal the edge of a hospital bracelet tucked inside. A name printed in faded ink, Noah Brooks. Adrian didn't see it clearly, not yet, but he saw enough to register that something didn't add up, that there was a context missing from this equation. And suddenly, the money on the table felt less like control and more like a question he didn't have the answer to. The music faded again, softer this time, like it understood it had served its purpose, and Maya stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just finished, like closing a chapter. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, charged, the kind of silence that demanded interpretation. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through it with quiet authority. "Do it again," he said, nodding toward a group of guests who had been watching from the side. Their expressions mixed between curiosity and amusement, a test within a test. Maya's eyes met his then, steady, unflinching, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her at all. "No," she said, simple, clear, not loud, but impossible to ignore. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Adrian's jaw tightened just a fraction, not in anger, but in recognition, because refusal, real refusal, wasn't something he encountered often, especially not from someone in her position. "You were paid?" he replied, not raising his voice, just stating a fact as he saw it. Maya glanced at the money again, then back at him, and for a moment, something flickered in her expression, not fear, not regret, but something closer to resolve. "I haven't taken it," she answered, her voice calm, almost gentle, as if she was reminding him of something he had overlooked, and then she turned, just like that, no hesitation, no glance back, and began to walk away, the sound of her steps soft against the polished floor, each one carrying a weight he couldn't quite define. Adrian's gaze followed her, something unfamiliar settling in his chest, not irritation, not exactly, but something sharper, more persistent, curiosity laced with a thread of something else, something he wasn't used to feeling. And as she reached the door, the bag at her side shifted slightly, the hospital bracelet slipping just enough into the light for him to catch the name clearly this time. Noah Brooks, and something about it hit a place in his memory he hadn't visited in years, a place tied to a past he had long since categorized, controlled, buried. And for the first time that night, the equation changed, because this wasn't just about a woman who refused his money. This was about a story he didn't know, a variable he hadn't accounted for. And Adrian Khalil did not like not knowing. The door closed behind Maya with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than the music ever had. And for a moment Adrian Khalil remained seated, his eyes fixed on the space she had just left behind, the glass in his hand untouched, the room slowly returning to its usual rhythm as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had, and he could feel it in the way his thoughts refused to settle. Vanessa Clark leaned slightly toward him from across the table, her voice smooth but edged with amusement. "You let her walk out," she said, lifting her glass, her tone implying that the outcome was obvious, expected, unremarkable. Adrian did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting instead to the stack of cash still sitting exactly where he had placed it, untouched, perfectly aligned, as if it had never been part of the equation at all. "Interesting choice," Vanessa added, her eyes scanning the room before returning to him. Most people in her position would not hesitate. Adrian finally shifted, leaning back slightly, his expression composed, but his mind anything but. "She is not most people," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Vanessa let out a small laugh, dismissive. "Or she is just better at pretending," she replied. But Adrian did not agree, not this time, because he had seen something in Maya's movement, something that did not align with performance, something that could not be faked under pressure. And more importantly, he had seen that name, Noah Brooks, and it had lodged itself somewhere in his memory, persistent, unresolved, like a note out of place in a song he used to know. "Find her," he said suddenly, his tone shifting from observation to instruction. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, intrigued now. "You do not even know her last name," she pointed out, but Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. "Brooks," he replied, the name steady on his tongue. "Maya Brooks." Vanessa paused for half a second, processing, then gave a small nod, already reaching for her phone, because that was how his world worked. Information was always within reach, identities could be traced, lives could be mapped, and yet, as Adrian stood and adjusted his jacket, he felt something unfamiliar, not uncertainty exactly, but a lack of control over how this would unfold, and he did not like that feeling. Outside, the night air was cooler, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement, traffic moving in a steady, indifferent flow. Maya walked quickly at first, her breath shallow, her hands trembling slightly as she tightened her grip on her bag, the adrenaline from the moment still pulsing through her. But as she turned the corner and the noise of the club faded behind her, her pace slowed, her shoulders dropping just a fraction, as if the weight she had been holding inside finally had space to settle. She reached into her bag without looking, her fingers finding the folded paper she knew was there, the pharmacy receipt, the numbers printed clearly, a total she could not ignore. She exhaled slowly, her gaze lifting briefly to the streetlights above. I am trying, she whispered under her breath, not to anyone in particular, just to the quiet. As if saying it out loud made it more real, more possible. A bus passed by, the rush of air tugging lightly at her hair, and for a second, she closed her eyes, picturing Noah, the way he had smiled that morning despite the tiredness in his eyes, the way he trusted her without question, and that was what steadied her, not the money she had left behind, not the opportunity she had walked away from, but the simple, unwavering fact that she needed to be someone he could believe in. She adjusted the strap of her bag again, unaware that the hospital bracelet had slipped further into view, the name catching the glow of a passing car's headlights. Back inside the car waiting at the curb, Adrian slid into the back seat without a word, the door closing quietly behind him as the driver pulled into traffic, the city moving around them in a blur of light and motion. He leaned his head back slightly, his eyes closing for just a moment, and there it was again, that name, Noah Brooks. Clearer now, more defined, and with it, a memory he had not expected to revisit. A hospital hallway. Years ago, the smell of antiseptic, the quiet tension of waiting rooms where time seemed to stretch endlessly. He opened his eyes again, his gaze sharpening as the connection hovered just out of reach. Do we have anything? He asked, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that signaled urgency. Vanessa's voice came through the speaker a few seconds later, efficient, precise. Maya Brooks, 32, single mother, part-time work, no criminal record, limited financial history, and she paused briefly, scrolling. A son, Noah Brooks, 8 years old, currently undergoing treatment at Westbridge Children's Medical Center. Adrian's fingers stilled against the leather seat, the name landing fully now, not just a fragment, but a point of connection. What kind of treatment? He asked, his tone quieter, more focused. Vanessa hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered, cardiac condition, ongoing care, expensive. Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting to the window as the city lights streaked past, everything aligning now in a way that changed the context of what had happened. The refusal, the dance, the decision to walk away. It was not pride for the sake of pride. It was something else, something rooted in necessity and boundaries he did not fully understand yet. And that realization unsettled him more than he expected, because it meant that whatever game he thought he was playing, he had misunderstood the rules entirely. Schedule a visit, he said finally, his voice steady again. But there was something new beneath it, something less calculated, more personal. Vanessa did not question it. To the hospital? She asked, confirming. Adrian's eyes remained on the passing lights, his reflection faint in the glass. Yes, he replied. And do not announce it. The line went quiet for a moment before she responded, understood. The call ended, and Adrian leaned back again, the city continuing its endless motion outside. But inside, something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, because for the first time in a long time, this was not about control, or prediction, or outcome. This was about a story he had stepped into without knowing its beginning, and the more he thought about it, the more certain he became of one thing. Maya Brooks had not walked away from his money. She had walked away from something much bigger, and he needed to understand why morning came too early and too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel louder than it should be. The steady beep of a monitor, the soft shuffle of nurses in the hallway, the faint hum of machines that never truly slept. Maya sat beside Noah's bed, her fingers wrapped gently around his smaller hand, her thumb moving in slow circles as if memorizing the warmth of his skin. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin stripes across the room, touching the edge of the chair, the corner of the blanket, the hospital bracelet that rested loosely around his wrist. Noah Brooks, the same name that had followed her through the night, and into this moment, he stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to find her. Did you go to work? He asked, his voice soft, still heavy with sleep. Maya smiled. Not forced. Not fragile, but steady, the kind of smile she saved only for him. I did, she answered, brushing a curl away from his forehead, and I am right where I need to be. Noah looked at her for a second longer, as if measuring the truth in her words, then nodded, satisfied in a way only children could be, trusting without needing proof. Are we okay? He asked, The question simple but carrying more weight than he understood. Maya's chest tightened for just a fraction of a second, but her hand did not stop moving. Her voice did not waver. "We are going to be okay," she said. And this time, she almost believed it. Across the city, Adrian Khalil stepped into the private elevator of Westbridge Children's Medical Center, the doors closing behind him with a quiet precision that matched everything else in his world, controlled, efficient, predictable. But as the elevator began to rise, he felt that same unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. Not discomfort, not quite, but something that resisted being categorized. He glanced briefly at his reflection in the mirrored wall. The same composed expression, the same measured calm, and yet there was something beneath it now, something unsettled. The doors opened on the pediatric floor, and the difference was immediate. The air felt lighter here, softer, walls painted in colors meant to comfort, small drawings taped to doors, evidence of lives paused but still moving forward in small, determined ways. Adrian stepped out, his gaze scanning the hallway, not for direction, but for understanding, because this was not a place he visited, not part of his routine, not part of the world he had built around himself. A nurse passed by with a gentle smile, unaware of who he was, and for a moment, that anonymity felt almost grounding. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. Adrian nodded once, his voice calm. "I am looking for Noah Brooks." The nurse's expression shifted slightly, recognition mixed with concern. "Room 214, she said, gesturing down the hall. "But visiting hours are," she paused, noticing something in his demeanor that made her finish differently. "Just be mindful." Adrian inclined his head in acknowledgement and moved forward, his steps quieter now, more deliberate. Each door he passed marked with a name, a story, a life unfolding in ways he had never considered. When he reached room 214, he stopped, just for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the doorframe, as if crossing that threshold required more than a simple step. Inside, Maya laughed softly at something Noah had said, the sound light, genuine, a contrast to everything Adrian had seen of her the night before. He watched through the small window, unnoticed, the way she leaned closer, the way her presence filled the room with something warm, something steady. And for a second, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to do, but because he was not sure what this moment required of him. Then Maya turned slightly, her eyes catching the movement outside the door, and everything shifted instantly. Her posture straightened, her expression changed, not cold, but guarded, aware. She stood slowly, her hand leaving Noah's, and walked to the door, opening it just enough to step into the hallway, closing it gently behind her. "You should not be here," she said, her voice low but firm. Adrian met her gaze, the same steadiness he had seen the night before, but now layered with something else, something protective. "I needed to understand," he replied, not defensive, not commanding, just direct. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. "Understand what?" she asked, and there it was, the line between their worlds, clear and unyielding. Adrian glanced briefly at the door behind her, then back at her. "Why you walked away?" he said, the question simple, but the answer anything but. Maya let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slightly. "You think this is about your money?" she asked, not mocking, just tired. Adrian did not answer immediately, because for the first time, he was not certain, and that uncertainty showed, just for a second, in the way his gaze shifted, in the way his usual confidence paused. Maya saw it, and something in her expression softened, not toward him, but toward the moment itself. "I did not walk away from you," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. "I walked toward something that matters more." Adrian followed her gaze as it flicked briefly toward the door, toward the room where Noah rested, and the realization settled deeper now, heavier, more complex than he had anticipated. "He is the reason," Adrian said quietly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. Maya nodded once, her hand instinctively moving to the strap of her bag, as if grounding herself in something familiar. "He is always the reason," she replied, and in that moment, the distance between them was not measured in money or status, but in understanding, in the choices they had made and the lives those choices had shaped. Adrian looked at her, really looked this time, not as a variable, not as a curiosity, but as a person standing in front of him with a reality he had never had to face. And something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to change what came next. Because this was no longer a game he controlled. This was a story unfolding on terms he had not set. And for the first time, he did not try to take control of it. He simply said, "Tell me what he needs." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of possibility, uncertainty, and a truth neither of them was ready to fully face, yet the hallway seemed quieter after his words settled between them, as if even the distant sounds of machines and footsteps had softened to listen. Maya did not answer right away, her eyes holding his, searching for something she did not fully trust was there, sincerity without condition, help without control, and that was not something she had learned to accept easily. "He needs a surgery," she said finally, her voice steady but carrying a weight that had been building for months. "A procedure we cannot afford." Adrian nodded once, absorbing the information without interruption, his mind already moving through possibilities, logistics, solutions, but something held him back from responding immediately, something about the way she said "we," the way it was not just a financial barrier but a shared burden. "Then let me take care of it," he said, simple, direct, the kind of offer that usually ended conversations, solved problems, closed gaps. But Maya's reaction was immediate, her head shaking before he even finished the sentence. "No," she replied, not harsh, but firm enough to stop him. Adrian's brow tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in confusion, because refusal still did not align with the patterns he understood. "This is not about pride," he said, his tone measured. "It is about time and options and giving him the best chance." Maya's gaze softened just a fraction at the mention of Noah, but her stance did not change. "And what does it cost?" she asked quietly. Adrian paused, because that question, phrased that way, shifted the entire conversation. "Nothing," he answered. But even as he said it, he knew that was not how she would hear it. Maya let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Nothing is never nothing," she said, her eyes steady again. "Not in your world." Adrian held her gaze, recognizing the truth in her words, even if it was not his intention. "Then tell me what it would need to be," he said instead, adjusting, not insisting. And that was new. Maya studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring the difference between what he was offering and what he understood. "I am not something you fix," she said slowly. "And he is not a problem you solve." Adrian nodded, accepting the distinction. "I understand that," he replied, and this time, there was no calculation behind it, just acknowledgement. A nurse stepped out of a nearby room, glancing briefly in their direction before continuing down the hall, the moment stretching again, filled with things neither of them had said yet. Inside the room, Noah shifted, his voice faintly calling, "Mom?" And that single word changed everything. Maya turned instinctively, her focus snapping back to what mattered most. She opened the door and stepped inside, leaving Adrian in the hallway. The barrier between them, both physical and symbolic, he did not follow, not yet. Instead, he remained where he was, listening to the quiet exchange inside. "I am right here," Maya said softly, her voice immediately warmer, lighter. "Who were you talking to?" Noah asked, curiosity threading through his tired tone. Maya hesitated for just a second, then answered honestly, "Someone who wants to help." Noah was quiet for a moment, then, "Is he nice?" he asked, the question simple, but layered in a way only children could manage. Maya glanced toward the door, her eyes lingering on the outline of Adrian's presence just beyond it. "I do not know yet," she admitted. Adrian heard that, every word of it, and something about that answer settled deeper than anything else had so far, because it was not rejection, not acceptance, but something in between, something he would have to earn. And that realization shifted his approach again. When Maya stepped back into the hallway a few minutes later, her expression was calmer, more centered, but the tension had not disappeared. It had simply found its place. Adrian straightened slightly, meeting her where she was rather than trying to move her somewhere else. "There is a foundation," he said, his voice even. "It operates independently, supports cases like this. No direct connection to me." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in consideration. "And this foundation just happens to appear now?" she asked. Adrian allowed the smallest hint of honesty to show. I asked them to review his case, he said, but they will make their own decision. Maya crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, just thinking, weighing. And if they say no, she asked. Adrian did not hesitate this time. Then I will ask again, he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, not forceful, not entitled, but persistent, that made her pause, because persistence was something she understood, something she lived every day. Why? She asked finally, the question. Quieter now, less guarded, more direct. Adrian looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, the answer was not about logic or explanation. It was simpler than that. Because you walked away, he said, and the words hung between them. Unexpected, unpolished, but true. Maya's expression shifted, just slightly, enough to show that something in that answer reached her, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the tone of the moment. That is not a reason, she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it had before. Adrian gave a small nod, accepting that. It is for me, he replied, and for the first time since they had met, there was no power in his voice, no expectation, just a statement of something he had not yet fully understood himself. The silence that followed was different now, less about distance and more about possibility. Maya exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. If anything happens, she said carefully, it has to be because he deserves it, not because I said yes or no to you. Adrian nodded immediately. Agreed, he said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no adjustment, just alignment. Maya studied him for one last moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not acceptance, not trust, but something close enough to continue. And as she turned back toward the room, Adrian remained in the hallway, not stepping forward, not stepping away, understanding now that this was not about moving faster, but about moving right, because whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something he could define alone. The hospital corridor felt different that afternoon, not quieter, not louder, but charged in a way Maya could not quite explain, as if something unseen had shifted just beneath the surface. She sat beside Noah again, her hand resting lightly over his as he traced small patterns on the blanket with his finger. Are we going home soon? He asked, his voice hopeful in that careful way children used when they were not sure of the answer. Maya smiled gently, adjusting the edge of his blanket. Soon, she said, her tone warm but measured, because soon was a word she had learned to stretch, to shape into something that could hold both truth and comfort at the same time. Noah nodded, satisfied for now, his attention drifting back to the cartoon playing quietly on the screen across the room. Maya's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before shifting toward the window, the city stretching out beyond the glass, distant, indifferent, moving forward whether she was ready or not. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folded letter she had read too many times to count, the hospital estimate. Numbers that did not change no matter how often she looked at them. She exhaled slowly, folding it back with care, as if precision could somehow make the burden lighter. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up, expecting a nurse, but instead found a woman in a tailored suit standing in the doorway, composed, confident, her presence immediately altering the tone of the room. Maya Brooks, the woman asked, her voice polite but direct. Maya stood slowly, her body instinctively placing itself between the visitor and Noah. Yes, she replied, cautious but steady. The woman stepped inside just enough to close the door behind her, offering a small, professional smile. My name is Vanessa Clark. I represent a private foundation that reviews special medical cases. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, recognition flickering beneath her calm expression, not of the name, but of the timing, of the connection she had already begun to suspect. That was fast, she said quietly. Vanessa's smile did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, as if she had expected that. Response. We prioritize urgent cases, she replied smoothly, and your son's file raised immediate attention. Maya crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, just grounded. And what does that mean? She asked. Vanessa took a small step forward, her tone shifting from formal to reassuring. It means we are prepared to cover the full cost of Noah's procedure, including post-operative care and follow-up treatments. The words landed clearly, precisely, leaving no room for misunderstanding. But Maya did not react the way Vanessa expected. There was no visible relief, no immediate gratitude, only a stillness, a pause that stretched longer than comfort allowed. "On what condition?" Maya asked, her voice calm, but firm enough to hold the weight of the question. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, as if surprised. "There is no condition," she said. "This is a grant, not a loan." Maya's gaze did not waver. "Nothing is free," she replied, echoing her own words from earlier, and for the first time, Vanessa's composure shifted just enough to reveal something beneath it, not uncertainty, but calculation. "The only requirement," Vanessa continued carefully, "is consent to proceed with treatment through our partnered specialists." Maya considered that, her eyes flicking briefly to Noah, then back to Vanessa. "And who asked you to look at his case?" she asked, her tone quieter now, but more pointed. Vanessa paused, just long enough to make the silence noticeable. "We receive recommendations from multiple sources," she answered. "Technically true, but not complete." Maya let out a slow breath, nodding slightly as if acknowledging the answer without accepting it. "You can tell him," she said, her voice steady, "that this does not change anything." Vanessa's expression softened just a fraction, curiosity slipping through the professionalism. "He did not ask for anything in return," she said, almost gently. Maya's lips pressed together briefly, her gaze shifting once more to Noah, who looked back at her with quiet trust. "That is exactly why it matters," she replied, her voice lower now, more personal. Vanessa studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, reaching into her folder and placing a set of documents on the table beside the bed. "Take your time," she said, her tone returning to its composed neutrality. "But time is something your son does not have in abundance." The words were not meant as pressure, but they landed that way anyway. Heavy, unavoidable. Vanessa turned toward the door, pausing just before she opened it. "For what it is worth," she added, glancing back. "He did not expect you to say yes." And then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Maya stood still for a moment, the room settling back into its earlier quiet. But nothing felt the same. She looked down at the documents, then at Noah, then back at the door, as if tracing the path of something she could not yet fully see. "Mom?" Noah's voice pulled her back, gentle but grounding. "Is everything okay?" Maya walked back to his side, sitting down slowly, her hand finding his again. "It might be," she said, her voice softer now, more uncertain, but not afraid. Noah smiled, small but real. "See, I told you," he said, and she smiled back, because in his world, belief was enough, but in hers, belief had to be chosen, carefully, deliberately. And as she picked up the papers and began to read, she realized that this choice was not about accepting help. It was about deciding whether she could trust the person offering it. And somewhere across the city, Adrian Khalil stood by his window, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, his reflection faint against the glass, waiting, not for control, not for outcome, but for an answer he knew he could not force. The papers felt heavier than they should have as Maya sat alone in the dim hospital room long after Noah had fallen asleep, the soft rhythm of the monitor filling the silence while her eyes moved slowly across each line, every number, every term, every carefully written clause that promised help without asking for anything in return. And that was exactly what made it harder to believe. She turned the page again, her fingers brushing against the edge where the paper had been handled too many times already, not by her, but by people who lived in a world where decisions like this were routine, efficient, detached. And yet for her, this was not routine, this was everything. She leaned back slightly in the chair, her gaze drifting from the documents to Noah, his small frame barely shifting beneath the blanket, his breathing steady, peaceful in a way that felt almost fragile, as if even that calm depended on choices she had not made yet. "You deserve more than this." "Waiting," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible even to herself, and the words lingered in the air as if asking her the same question she had been avoiding. What was she really protecting? And at what cost? Across the city, Adrian Khalil stood in his office, the lights low, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass, his reflection faint but present, his phone resting untouched on the desk in front of him. He had built an entire life on action, on decisions made quickly and executed precisely. But this required something different: patience, restraint, something he had not needed to practice in a very long time. Vanessa stood a few steps away, her posture composed but her attention focused entirely on him. "She has the documents," she said, her voice calm. "Professional." Adrian nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the city. "And?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Vanessa hesitated for a fraction of a second. "She has not signed," she replied. And the silence that followed was not surprising, but it was heavier than either of them expected. Adrian exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk. "Good," he said finally, and Vanessa's brow lifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in curiosity. "You expected hesitation," she said. Adrian turned then, his expression steady but different now, less guarded, more thoughtful. "I expected her to choose carefully," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this was no longer about outcome, but about respect for the process itself. Vanessa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "And if she says no?" she asked. Adrian's gaze did not waver. "Then we accept that," he said, though even as he spoke, there was a quiet tension beneath the words, not resistance, but a recognition of what that would mean. Back in the hospital, Maya set the papers aside, her decision still unmade, her thoughts moving in circles that never seemed to settle. She stood slowly, stretching slightly before walking toward the window, the glass cool beneath her fingertips, the city lights flickering in the distance, so many lives moving forward, so many choices made without hesitation, and yet here she was, standing still, not because she could not decide, but because she understood the weight of deciding too quickly. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet fill the space around her, and in that stillness, memories surfaced, not loud, not overwhelming, but present. The promises she had made to herself, the lines she had drawn, the boundaries she had fought to keep, and now, for the first time, those boundaries were being tested in a way that did not feel like pressure, but like possibility. She opened her eyes again, her gaze steady now, clearer than before. She turned back, toward the bed, toward Noah, and without hesitation this time, she reached for the papers again, her hand moving with a purpose that had not been there before. She sat down, picking up the pen, but instead of signing immediately, she paused, her eyes scanning the final page once more, not for doubt, but for understanding. And then she did something unexpected. She stood, gathering the documents together, and walked toward the door, stepping into the hallway where the lights were softer, the air quieter, and she moved with a calm determination that had replaced the uncertainty from before. She did not go to the nurse's station. She did not look for Vanessa. Instead, she stopped just outside the elevator, her hand hovering briefly over the button before pressing it, the soft chime echoing lightly as the doors opened. Because this decision, she realized, was not something she could make alone in a room, not something she could reduce to ink on paper without first facing the person behind it. And as the elevator doors closed, carrying her down through the building, through layers of noise and quiet, doubt and clarity, one thought remained steady, not a question, not a fear, but a resolve. If she was going to accept this, it would not be because she was out of options, it would be because she chose it on her own terms. And somewhere above, in a quiet room filled with soft light and steady breathing, Noah slept on, unaware that the choice his mother was about to make would change everything that came next. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that felt louder than it should have, and Maya stepped out into the quiet lobby, the polished floors reflecting the dim evening lights, her reflection moving with her, steady, resolved, the folder held firmly in her hands. She paused for just a second, her eyes scanning the space, as if grounding herself in something real before taking the next step. And then she saw him. Adrian Khalil stood near the far window, his silhouette framed by the city lights beyond the glass, his posture still, composed, but there was something in the way he held himself now, less distant, less untouchable, as if the space between who he was and where he stood had shifted. He turned slightly at the sound of her steps, his gaze finding her without surprise, as if he had expected this moment, even without knowing when it would come. Neither of them spoke right away, the distance between them filled with everything that had not been said yet. Maya walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, not hesitant, not rushed, and when she stopped a few feet away, she met his eyes directly, not as someone asking for help, but as someone choosing to have a conversation on equal ground. "I read everything," she said, her voice calm. "Even," Adrian nodded once, his attention fully on her. "And?" he asked, not pushing, not assuming, just waiting. Maya held the folder slightly tighter, her fingers pressing against the edges as if anchoring herself in the decision she had come to make. "If I sign this," she said slowly, "it is not because I need you." The words were clear, intentional, and Adrian did not interrupt, did not correct, he simply listened. "It is because my son deserves every chance he can get," she continued, her gaze unwavering. Adrian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in that. "That is exactly why it is there," he replied, his tone steady, but softer than before. Maya studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring not just his words, but the space behind them, the intent, the absence of pressure, and then she took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic. "And you," she said, her voice quieter now, more personal, "what do you get from this?" Adrian paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that the wrong one would undo everything that had brought them to this point. He looked at her, not as a problem to solve, not as a situation to manage, but as a person asking a real question. "Clarity," he said finally, the word simple, but carrying more weight than its sound suggested. Maya's brow furrowed slightly. "About what?" she asked. Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the city before returning to her. "About why you walked away," he said. And there it was again, that moment, that choice that had disrupted everything he thought he understood. Maya let out a small breath, something almost like a smile touching her expression, not because the answer was amusing, but because it was honest in a way she had not expected. "You still do not understand," she said. Gently, Adrian gave a small nod, accepting that. "Then help me," he replied, and the simplicity of that request, the lack of control in it, the absence of expectation, changed something in the air between them. Maya looked down briefly at the papers, then back up at him, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade into the background, the distant sounds of the city, the quiet hum of the building, everything narrowing to this conversation, this choice. "I walked away because I have spent too long being treated like I should be grateful for whatever I am given," she said, her voice steady, but carrying a depth that had been built over years. "And I am not teaching my son that his worth depends on someone else's generosity." Adrian listened without interruption, each word settling into place, reshaping the way he understood her, reshaping the way he understood this entire situation. "But this," Maya continued, lifting the folder slightly, "this is different if I accept. This, it is because it meets him where he is, not where you think he should be." Adrian nodded slowly, the distinction clear now in a way it had not been before. "Then that is what it is," he said, and for the first time, there was no attempt to define it further, no need to control the narrative, just agreement. Maya held his gaze for one more second, then opened the folder, flipping to the final page, the pen resting neatly against the paper as if waiting for this exact moment. Her hand moved, without hesitation now, signing her name in a steady, deliberate motion, not rushed, not uncertain, and when she finished, she closed the folder and handed it back to him, not as a transaction, but as a completed decision. Adrian took it, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge, his expression unchanged on the surface, but something deeper had shifted, something that had nothing to do with the document itself. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet, but sincere. Maya shook her head slightly. "Do not thank me," she replied. "Just make sure it means something." Adrian met her gaze, understanding now that this was not a favor, not a gesture, but a responsibility. "It will," he said, and this time, there was no doubt in his voice. Maya gave a small nod, the tension that had been holding her steady, finally easing just a fraction, and without another word, she turned, walking back toward the elevator, her steps lighter now, not because the situation had changed, but because the decision had been made. And as the doors closed behind her, Adrian remained where he was, the signed papers in his hand, the city still stretching endlessly beyond the glass. But for the first time, it did not feel distant, it felt connected. As if somewhere within that vast, moving landscape, there was a story, unfolding that he was no longer observing from the outside, but living from within, and that realization stayed with him long after she was gone. The next morning arrived with a different kind of quiet, not the heavy uncertainty that had filled the previous days, but something steadier, something that felt like movement even before anything had visibly changed. Maya stood by the window in Noah's hospital room, her arms folded loosely as she watched the early lights stretch across the city. The signed decision now behind her, but the consequences of it just beginning to unfold. She turned as the door opened softly, a nurse stepping in with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Maya," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt more personal than routine. "We have scheduled Noah's procedure for tomorrow morning." Maya nodded slowly, absorbing the words, the timeline suddenly real, immediate, her gaze shifting instinctively to Noah, who was sitting up in bed, his expression curious. "Tomorrow?" he repeated, his voice small but steady. Maya moved closer, sitting beside him and brushing her hand lightly over his shoulder. "Tomorrow," she confirmed, her tone calm, grounded, the kind of calm she had learned to create even when she did not fully feel it. Noah looked at her for a moment, searching her face for something, and whatever he found there seemed to reassure him, because he nodded once, a small, brave gesture. "Okay," he said, as if it were just another plan, just another day, and Maya smiled, because that was the strength she held on to. The way he trusted her without needing details, without needing guarantees. Later that afternoon, Adrian Khalil stood just outside the observation window of the pediatric wing, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he watched the quiet rhythm of the floor, doctors moving with purpose, nurses adjusting equipment, families sitting close to one another in ways that spoke of both hope and fear. He had visited many facilities, funded entire wings, approved budgets that shaped spaces like this. But standing here now felt different, more personal, less abstract. Vanessa approached quietly, her heels barely making a sound against the polished floor. "Everything is in place," she said, her tone efficient, but softer than usual. Adrian nodded without looking away from the window. "And the surgeons?" he asked. Vanessa glanced at her tablet briefly. "Top of their field, flown in this morning. They reviewed Noah's case overnight." Adrian exhaled slowly, a subtle release of tension he had not fully acknowledged until now. "Good," he said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with the quiet weight of what was about to happen. "You are more invested than usual," Vanessa observed after a few seconds, not accusing, just noting. Adrian turned slightly, his gaze shifting to her. "This is not usual," he replied simply. And that was enough, because there was no need to explain further. Back inside the room, Maya sat beside Noah again, helping him with a small tray of food he had barely touched, her movements gentle, patient. "You have to eat a little," she encouraged softly. Noah made a small face, but took another bite anyway. "Will you be there?" he asked suddenly, looking up at her. Maya did not hesitate. "Every second," she answered, her voice steady, and he nodded. Satisfied, his trust absolute. A quiet knock interrupted them, and this time, when the door opened, it was Adrian who stepped inside, not in a suit that commanded attention, but in something simpler, more neutral, as if he had chosen to enter this space without bringing his world fully with him. Maya looked up, her expression unreadable for a brief moment before settling into something calmer, more accepting. "You came back," she said, not surprised, but acknowledging. Adrian nodded once, his gaze moving briefly to Noah before returning to her. "I said I would," he replied, his tone even, but carrying a quiet sincerity. Noah looked between them, curious. "Is he the one helping?" he asked, his voice direct in the way only a child's could be. Maya glanced at Adrian, then back at Noah. "He is part of it," she said carefully. Adrian stepped a little closer, not too close, just enough to be present. "Hi, Noah," he said, his voice softer now, adjusted without effort. Noah studied him for a second, then gave a small nod. "Hi," he replied, and in that simple exchange, something shifted again, something that had nothing to do with contracts or decisions, but everything to do with connection. Adrian looked at Maya, then back at Noah. "You are in good hands," he said, not as reassurance alone, but as a statement of fact. Noah seemed to accept that easily, because in his world, people either showed up or they did not, and Adrian had shown up. "Mom says that too," Noah added, and Maya smiled faintly at that. A small moment of alignment that felt larger than it looked. The afternoon moved forward quietly after that. Conversations softer, pauses longer, the anticipation building not in dramatic waves, but in steady increments. And as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the room, Maya stood again by the window, her arms resting lightly at her sides. Adrian joined her a few steps away, not intruding, just present. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said after a moment, his voice low. Maya nodded slightly, her eyes still on the city beyond the glass. "It does," she agreed. Then after a pause, she added, "But not in the way you think." Adrian glanced at her, curious. "How so?" he asked. Maya turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Because no matter what happens, I am still the same person who walked away from you," she said, her tone calm, grounded in something deeper than circumstance. Adrian held her gaze, understanding now that this was not defiance, but identity, something she would not trade, not even for certainty. "And I am still the one trying to understand that," he replied, and for the first time, there was no tension in the exchange, no imbalance. Just two people standing in the same moment, facing what came next in their own way. And as the light faded and the room settled into evening, the only thing that remained clear was that tomorrow was no longer just about a procedure. It was about everything that had led them here, and everything that would follow after the morning of the procedure arrived before the sun had fully risen. The hospital wrapped in that fragile quiet that exists just before everything begins to move. Maya stood beside Noah's bed, helping him into the thin hospital gown, her hands steady even as her thoughts moved faster than she could control. "Is it going to hurt?" Noah asked softly, his eyes searching hers for something real, something certain. Maya paused for just a fraction of a second, then placed her hand gently against his cheek. "They are going to take care of you," she said, her voice calm, grounded. "And I will be right here when you wake up." Noah nodded slowly, accepting her answer the way he always did, trusting the feeling behind her words more than the words themselves. A nurse stepped in quietly, her presence gentle but purposeful. "We are ready for him," she said, offering a reassuring smile. Maya took a slow breath, then nodded, stepping back slightly as they prepared to move Noah's bed, her hand never leaving his, not until the very last moment. "I love you," she whispered, leaning down just enough for him to hear. Noah smiled faintly. "I know," he replied, and then he was being wheeled out, the bed moving steadily down the hallway, Maya walking beside it for as long as she was allowed, until the doors marked "authorized" personnel only came into view, the line she could not cross. She stopped there, her hand slipping from his as the bed continued forward, and just like that, the space between them widened, filled with distance she could not control. She stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the closed doors long after they had disappeared behind them, and only then did she allow herself to exhale, slow and unsteady, as if she had been holding her breath since the moment she woke up. "He is strong." Adrian's voice came from just behind her, calm, steady. Maya turned slightly, not surprised to see him there, but aware of his presence in a way that felt different now, less intrusive, more aligned. "He has to be," she replied quietly, her gaze returning to the doors. Adrian stepped closer, not too close, just enough to stand beside her, both of them facing the same direction, both of them waiting for something neither could influence anymore. "And you?" he asked after a moment, his tone softer than it had been before. Maya let out a small breath, her arms folding loosely as if holding herself together. "I do not have a choice," she said, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact. Adrian nodded slowly, understanding that strength sometimes looked exactly like that, like staying in place when leaving would be easier. Time moved differently in that hallway, slower, heavier, each minute stretching into something that felt longer than it should. Maya sat down finally, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything at the same time. Adrian remained standing for a while, then took a seat, a few feet away, not intruding, just present, the the silence between them not empty, but shared. "You have done this before," Maya said suddenly. Not looking at him, Adrian glanced over. "Not like this," he replied honestly. Maya gave a small nod, as if she had expected that answer. "Then you do not know what this feels like," she said, her voice steady. Adrian did not argue, did not correct. "No," he said simply. And that honesty, that lack of pretense, shifted something again, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Hours passed, marked only by the quiet movement of staff and the occasional update that said nothing more than still in progress. Maya listened to each one, her expression unchanged, her focus unwavering. Adrian watched her, not studying, not analyzing, but observing in a way that felt different now, more human, more aware, and somewhere in that time, something inside him settled, not an answer, not a conclusion, but a recognition that this moment, this waiting, was not something he could fix or accelerate. It simply had to be lived through. Finally, the doors opened, and everything shifted at once. Maya stood immediately, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. A doctor stepped out, his expression calm, measured. "The procedure is complete," he said, and for a second, Maya did not move, did not speak, as if the words needed time to reach her. "And," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor's expression softened slightly. "He did well," he said, and that was enough. The tension that had been holding her steady released all at once, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, her shoulders lowering, her breath returning, her eyes closing just for a second as she let the words settle. Adrian watched her, the moment unfolding in a way that had nothing to do with him, and yet everything to do with why he was there. Maya opened her eyes again, her gaze clearer now, steadier. "Can I see him?" she asked. The doctor nodded. "In a few minutes," he replied. "They are moving him to recovery." Maya nodded, her focus already shifting forward, already moving toward the next step, because that was what she did. She kept going. Even when the hardest part was behind her, Adrian stood slowly, his hands at his sides, his expression calm. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that had not been there before. Not just understanding, but respect, deeper, quieter. And as Maya walked toward the recovery area, he did not follow immediately. He stayed where he was for a moment longer, watching her, recognizing that whatever had begun between them was no longer defined by a single moment or decision, but by everything they had just lived through together. Even if they had experienced it in completely different ways, recovery felt quieter than the waiting, but not lighter. The soft beeping of monitors returning in a slower rhythm, the lights dimmer, the air calmer, as if the room itself understood that something difficult had just passed and needed space to settle. Maya stepped carefully to Noah's bedside, her movements slower now, more deliberate, her eyes scanning every detail, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the slight movement of his fingers beneath the blanket, the faint crease in his brow that softened as she reached for his hand. "I am here," she whispered, her voice barely above the quiet hum of the machines, and though his eyes remained closed, his fingers shifted just enough to curl lightly around hers, a response so small it could have been missed, but Maya felt it fully, her shoulders lowering as she exhaled, a breath she had been holding for far too long. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forehead against the edge of the bed for just a moment, not in exhaustion, but in relief, measured, controlled, the kind she allowed herself only when she knew he was safe. Outside the room, Adrian stood just beyond the glass, his gaze steady, watching without stepping in, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to her, to the quiet space between a mother and her child, where nothing else mattered. Vanessa approached quietly again, her presence composed as always, but even she seemed to carry a softer tone now. "The procedure went better than expected," she said, her voice low. Adrian nodded, his eyes still on the room. "He is strong," he replied, echoing his earlier words, but now with more certainty. Vanessa studied him briefly, then followed his gaze, watching Maya for a moment before speaking again. "You could go in," she suggested, not as a directive, but as an option. Adrian shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he said, and there was no hesitation in that answer. Because for the first time, he was choosing presence without intrusion. Time passed slowly in that quiet space, measured not by clocks, but by small signs of recovery, the gradual steadiness of breathing, the subtle return of color, the gentle shift of awareness. Maya remained beside Noah, her hand never leaving his, her focus unwavering, until finally, his eyes opened, slowly, blinking, against the soft light. "Mom," he said, his voice faint, but clear enough to reach her immediately. Maya straightened, her expression softening in a way that held both relief and something deeper, something almost like gratitude. "I am right here," she said, her voice warm, steady. Noah looked at her for a moment, then smiled, small but real. "It is quiet," he said, as if noticing the difference. Maya let out a soft breath, a hint of a laugh in it. "That is because you did something very brave," she replied. Noah seemed to consider that, then nodded slightly, accepting it without needing more, his gaze drifting for a moment before returning to her. "Did he stay?" he asked, and Maya paused, just briefly, then glanced toward the door, where Adrian still stood, just out of direct view. "Yes," she said simply. Noah's eyes moved in that direction, curious but calm, and after a moment, Maya stood, walking to the door and opening it just enough to step into the hallway. Adrian turned slightly as she approached, his expression steady, but there was something different there now, something quieter, more grounded. "He is awake," she said, and those 3 words carried more weight than anything else she could have said. Adrian nodded once, a small but meaningful acknowledgement. "I am glad," he replied, and he meant it in a way that extended beyond the moment, beyond the situation. Maya held his gaze for a second longer, then stepped aside just slightly. Not an invitation, not a request, but a possibility. Adrian understood it for what it was, not a gesture of gratitude, but a recognition of presence, and after a brief pause, he stepped forward, entering the room carefully, his movements measured, respectful. Noah looked at him as he approached, his expression curious but not uncertain. "Hi again," Noah said, his voice still soft. Adrian gave a small nod, his tone matching the calm of the room. "Hi, Noah," he replied, standing a few feet away, not too close, just enough to be part of the moment without overwhelming it. Noah studied him for a second, then smiled faintly. "You stayed," he said, and Adrian nodded. "I said I would," he answered, and in that simple exchange, something settled into place. Something that had been building quietly through every step that had led them here. Maya watched from the side, her arms resting loosely, her expression thoughtful, not guarded, not fully open, but somewhere in between, a space that allowed for possibility without surrendering certainty. The room remained quiet after that, the kind of quiet that did not need to be filled, because everything that mattered had already been said in smaller ways, in presence, in consistency, in the choice to stay. And as the light outside began to shift toward evening again, casting softer shadows across the room, it became clear that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of something that none of them had fully defined yet, but all of them, in their own way, had already begun to accept the days after the procedure unfolded slowly, not in dramatic shifts, but in quiet, steady progress that revealed itself in small, meaningful ways, the kind of change that could only be noticed if you were paying close attention. Maya sat beside Noah as he leaned back against the pillows, a small tray balanced carefully in front of him, this time with more food missing than before, a detail she noticed immediately, her lips curving slightly in a quiet sign of relief. "You are eating more," she said softly. Noah shrugged just a little, as if it were no big deal, but the faint spark in his eyes told a different story. "I feel better," he replied, simple, honest, and Maya nodded, her hand brushing lightly over his shoulder, grounding herself in that truth. Across the room, sunlight filtered in through the window, softer now, warmer, touching everything with a sense of calm that had not been there before, and for the first time in a long time, the space did not feel like a place of waiting, but a place of healing. Later that afternoon, Adrian stood just outside the room again, his presence familiar now, no longer an interruption but part of the rhythm that had formed. Over the past few days, he had not missed a visit, not once, always arriving without announcement, always leaving without expectation. His consistency quiet but undeniable. Maya noticed it, even when she did not acknowledge it directly. Vanessa approached him with her usual composed expression, but there was something more measured in her tone now, less detached. "The press has started asking questions," she said, holding her tablet at her side. Adrian glanced at her briefly. "About what?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "About the foundation, about the sudden allocation of resources, about you," she replied, her voice steady. Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the room where Maya and Noah were. "And what are we telling them?" he asked. Vanessa hesitated for just a moment, then answered, "Nothing for now." Adrian nodded. "Keep it that way," he said, his tone calm but firm. Because whatever this was, it was not something he was willing to turn into a headline, not something he would allow to be reduced to a narrative that did not belong to them. Inside the room, Maya helped Noah adjust his blanket, her movements gentle, practiced. "You are getting stronger," she said. And this time, there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty beneath it, just truth. Noah smiled, small but certain. "I told you I would be okay," he said. And Maya laughed softly, the sound light, real, a release of something she had been holding for far too long. A quiet knock followed, and before she could respond, the door opened, Adrian stepping inside with that same measured presence. Not too close, not too distant, just enough. "Hi," Noah said immediately, his tone brighter now. Adrian returned the greeting with a small nod. "You look better," he said, and Noah nodded proudly. "I feel better," he replied, the simplicity of it carrying more weight than any detailed explanation could. Maya watched the exchange, her gaze thoughtful, taking in the ease that had developed between them, not forced, not constructed, but built slowly through presence and consistency. "They say he might be able to go home soon," she said, her voice directed more toward Adrian than Noah. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, a hint of something softer. "That is good," he replied, and it was, but the words carried something else beneath them, something unspoken. Maya noticed it, because she had learned to notice what people did not say just as much as what they did. "It changes things," she added, her tone calm, but deliberate. Adrian met her gaze, understanding that she was not just talking about Noah's recovery. "It does," he agreed, and the space between them held that truth for a moment, quiet but clear. Noah looked between them, sensing the shift without fully understanding it. "Are you going to visit us at home?" he asked suddenly, his voice hopeful, direct in the way only he could be. Maya's eyes moved to Adrian, not to answer for him, but to see what he would say. Adrian paused, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood what the question meant. Not just a visit, but a continuation, a crossing of boundaries that had not yet been fully defined. "If your mom is okay with it," he said finally, his tone steady, respectful, and that mattered more than the answer itself. Maya held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not a full acceptance, not a rejection, but something in between, something that allowed the possibility without committing to it entirely. "We will see," she said, and Noah smiled, satisfied with that, because in his world, possibilities were enough. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the room settled again into its quiet rhythm, but something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to be felt, because this was no longer just about recovery. It was about what came next, about how the lines between their worlds would adjust, stretch, or hold. And as Maya stood once more by the window, watching the city move beyond the glass, she realized that for the first time, she was not just thinking about surviving what came next. She was considering how to live it, and that was a difference she had not expected, but one she could no longer ignore. The day Noah was discharged arrived with a kind of quiet excitement that felt almost unfamiliar. The hospital room no longer filled with uncertainty, but with movement, small preparations that carried meaning far beyond their simplicity. Maya folded Noah's clothes carefully into a worn duffel bag, each motion deliberate, as if closing a chapter she had lived in for too long. Noah sat on the edge of the bed, his feet barely touching the floor, his energy still gentle but brighter now. "Do we really get to go home today?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and disbelief. Maya turned to him, her expression soft but certain. "We do," she said. And this time, there was no hesitation, no quiet doubt hidden behind the words, just truth. Noah smiled wider than she had seen in weeks, and that alone made everything that had come before feel worth it. A nurse stepped in briefly, reviewing final instructions, her tone warm, encouraging. He is doing very well, she said, offering Maya a reassuring look. Just keep things calm for the next few weeks. Maya nodded, absorbing every word, because calm was something she could give, something she had learned to create even when life did not offer it easily. Once the room was cleared, Maya paused for a moment, her gaze moving slowly across the space, the bed, the chair, the window, all the places that had held so much of their fear and hope. At the same time, and then she reached for Noah's hand. Ready? She asked. Noah nodded without hesitation. Ready, he replied, and together, they stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind the place that had changed everything. Downstairs, the late afternoon lights stretched across the hospital entrance, the city alive in that steady, familiar way, cars passing, people moving, life continuing, and for the first time in a long time, Maya felt like they were stepping back into it, not as survivors, but as something stronger, something steadier. As they reached the curb, a car pulled up smoothly, not loud, not attention-seeking, just present, and Maya paused, her grip tightening slightly on the bag, because she knew before the door even opened who it would be. Adrian stepped out, his presence calm, composed, but different now, less distant, more grounded in the moment. I thought you might need a ride, he said, his voice even, not assuming, not insisting, just offering. Maya looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, not closed, not fully open, but thoughtful, measuring. And then she glanced at Noah, who was already looking between them with quiet curiosity. We can take the bus, she said slowly, not rejecting, but stating. Adrian nodded once, accepting the possibility. You could, he replied. Then after a brief pause, or you could let me help this once. The words were simple, but they carried a different weight now, not the kind that demanded anything in return, but the kind that existed without expectation. Maya studied him for another second, and something in his tone, in the way he stood there without pressure, without entitlement, shifted her decision, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. This once, she said finally, her voice calm. Adrian gave a small nod. Stepping aside to open the door, Noah climbed in carefully, his movements still gentle but filled with a quiet excitement. Maya followed, her bag resting at her feet as she settled into the seat. And for a moment, as the car pulled away from the curb, there was a silence that felt different from before, not uncertain, not heavy, but reflective, the city moving past the window in a steady flow of light and motion. Where to? Adrian asked, his eyes meeting Maya's briefly in the mirror. Maya hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then gave the address, her voice steady, because this was her space, her world, and she was not giving that up, not even now. The drive was quiet, not awkward, just filled with thoughts none of them spoke out loud. Noah leaned slightly against the seat, watching the buildings pass with a small, content smile. Maya's gaze moved between him and the window, grounding herself in the reality of this moment, and Adrian, for once, did not try to fill the silence, did not turn it into something else. He simply let it exist. When the car finally slowed and stopped in front of a modest apartment building, Maya reached for her bag, her movements steady. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Adrian stepped out, opening the door again, his gaze taking in the building, not with judgment, but with understanding. You are home, he said, not as a statement, but as an acknowledgement. Maya nodded, her hand finding Noah's again as he stepped out beside her. We are, she replied, and for a moment, they stood there, the three of them, in a space that felt like a threshold between what had been and what could be. Noah looked up at Adrian, his expression thoughtful. Are you going to come visit? He asked again, the same question, but different now, because now it carried the weight of reality, not just possibility. Maya glanced at Adrian, not answering for him, not guiding the moment, just letting it unfold. Adrian met Noah's gaze, then looked at Maya, and something unspoken passed between them, not an agreement, not a promise, but a recognition of what this meant. If I am invited, he said finally, his tone steady, respectful. And Maya held his gaze for a second longer before giving a small nod. Not a full answer, but enough. Enough to leave the door open, enough to allow whatever this was to continue. And as she turned to lead Noah inside, the building door closing softly behind them, Adrian remained where he was for a moment longer, the city moving around him, unchanged and yet somehow different, because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what came next as something to control, but as something to be part of. And that realization stayed with him as he finally turned and walked back to the car, the story still unfolding, not finished, not defined, but real in a way he had not expected. The first week at home unfolded in quiet adjustments, not dramatic changes, but small, meaningful shifts that slowly rebuilt a rhythm Maya and Noah had almost forgotten. The apartment felt both familiar and new at the same time, sunlight stretching across the living room floor in the early morning, the soft hum of the refrigerator replacing the steady beeping of hospital monitors, and for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt earned. Noah sat on the couch wrapped in a light blanket, a book resting open in his lap, his focus stronger now, his energy returning in careful, measured ways. It smells like home, he said softly, glancing toward the kitchen where Maya stood, preparing something simple, something warm, something real. Maya smiled, not turning right away, letting the words settle before responding. That is because it is, she said, and the truth of it filled the space between them, grounding everything that had come before. Later that afternoon, a quiet knock echoed through the apartment, not loud, not urgent, just present. Maya paused for a moment, her hand stilling as she considered it. Then she walked to the door, opening it just enough to see who stood on the other side. Adrian Khalil, his posture the same composed calm she had come to recognize, but without the distance that had once defined him. I said I would wait for an invitation, he said, his voice steady. But I thought I would try anyway. Maya studied him for a second, her expression thoughtful, not surprised, not entirely unguarded either, just aware. You are early, she replied, not as a rejection, but as an observation. Adrian gave a small nod. I tend to be, he said. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the doorway holding that familiar space between them, until Noah's voice carried from the living room. Is it him? He called out, curiosity bright in his tone. Maya glanced back briefly, then opened the door a little wider, stepping aside just enough. Not a full invitation, but not a refusal either. Adrian understood it for what it was and stepped inside, his movements measured, respectful, his gaze taking in the space without judgment, without comment. Just awareness. Noah looked up immediately, a small smile forming. You came, he said, and Adrian nodded. I said I would. He replied, the words simple, but now carrying a consistency that made them real. Maya moved back toward the kitchen, not leaving them, but allowing the moment to unfold without controlling it, her presence still anchoring the room. You want something to drink? She asked, her tone neutral, but softer than before. Adrian hesitated for just a second, then nodded. Water is fine, he said, and even that small exchange felt different, not transactional, not formal, just part of a normal moment, something none of them had expected to share. Time passed quietly after that, conversation coming in small pieces, Noah asking questions that Adrian answered simply, without embellishment, without distance, Maya listening from nearby, her attention divided but present, watching not just what was said, but how it was said, how it felt, and slowly, almost without noticing, the space between them shifted again, not closing completely, but softening, becoming something that could hold more than it had before. As the afternoon light faded into evening, casting a warmer glow across the room, Noah leaned back slightly, his energy dipping just enough to remind them both that recovery was still ongoing. Maya moved closer instinctively, adjusting the blanket around him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. You should rest, she said gently. Noah nodded, not arguing, just accepting, his trust still the quiet constant that shaped everything around them. Adrian stood after a moment, sensing the shift. I should go, he said, not lingering, not waiting to be asked, just recognizing the moment for what it was. Maya looked at him, her expression thoughtful, and then she nodded. Thank you, she said, the words simple, but this time, they carried something different, not obligation, not distance, but acknowledgement. Adrian held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod in return. I will see you soon, he said, not as a promise, but as a possibility. Maya did not answer right away, but she did not close the door either, and that, in itself, was enough. As Adrian stepped out into the evening air, the city stretching around him in its usual rhythm, something inside him felt different, not resolved, not complete, but changed in a way that did not need immediate definition. And inside the apartment, Maya stood for a moment longer, her hand still resting lightly on Noah's shoulder, her gaze lingering on the door that remained slightly open, not wide, not closed, just enough to let something new exist in that space. And for the first time, she did not feel the need to close it right away, because whatever came next was not something she feared, it was something she was beginning to understand, one quiet moment at a time.